The air down here tasted like iron and forgotten secrets. Dr. Elias Thorne wiped the thick layer of dust from the viewing port of the reinforced door, his breath fogging the ancient glass. Beside him, Anya Sharma held the sputtering battery pack for the floodlight, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. They had spent 7 months tracking down the coordinates, 3 weeks tunneling through the collapsed sublevels of the abandoned Omega Research Facility, and now they were standing outside the vault that held the greatest mistake of 20th century physics. The structural integrity looks questionable, Elias, Anya whispered, her voice tight. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the fading label beneath the port. Project Chimera, containment level 5, do not activate. They didn't just abandon this place, Anya. They buried it, sealed it with concrete and denial, Elias murmured. He was a man defined by meticulous logic, but the sheer weight of history pressing against this door made his heart pound a rhythm that defied all scientific reasoning. He pulled the heavy magnetic keycard from his utility belt, a card they had salvaged from the facility director's preserved office, tucked inside a mildewed journal entry that simply read, "We saw too much. We must stop the signal. The regret is already spreading." Anya leaned closer. The journal mentioned the Chimera machine was designed to stabilize temporal anomalies. If they regretted turning it on, it means it didn't stabilize anything, right? It means, Elias said, inserting the card and hearing the low, grinding groan of ancient mechanisms engaging, that it did exactly what it was designed to do, and the results were intolerable. The door hissed open, revealing a cavernous circular chamber. The air inside was cold, dry, and carried a faint smell of ozone, despite being sealed for decades. In the absolute center of the room, bathed in the beam of Anya's struggling light, was the machine. It wasn't sleek or futuristic. It was heavy, brutalist, and built from materials they couldn't immediately identify. A chaotic tangle of copper coils, dull silver plates etched with meaningless symbols, and a central sphere of crystalline material that pulsed with an internal, dormant energy. It looked less like a device and more like a captured storm. Anya walked forward slowly, her boots crunching on fine, crystalline dust that coated the floor. She pointed to a console near the base, where a series of thick toggle switches sat beneath a heavy glass panel. "The power source is still connected," she breathed, tracing a finger along the dust-covered wires that fed into the machine from the surrounding walls. "It's been drawing minimal standby power this whole time, waiting." Elias followed, his skepticism warring violently with the undeniable reality of the device before him. He remembered the rumors that the original team had activated it for only 37 seconds before initiating the catastrophic shutdown sequence. Those 37 seconds were enough to wipe the project from official records and send the lead scientists into indefinite institutionalization. "We need to document everything before we touch it, Anya. We know nothing about its operational parameters. We only know the consequences were severe enough to warrant total abandonment," Elias insisted, pulling out his recording rig. Anya was already running diagnostics on the console. "The interface is proprietary, but the energy signature is unlike anything I've ever logged. It's pulling energy from somewhere else, not the grid." That's how they powered it, Elias realized, a chill running down his spine. They didn't use conventional electricity. They used the fundamental bleed-off of background radiation, harnessing pure ambient energy. Anya looked up, her face illuminated by the faint greenish glow now emanating from the central crystal sphere. "If it's been waiting this long, Elias, maybe it's time we find out why they regretted it. We came all this way. We can't just turn around." Elias felt the immense pressure of scientific curiosity pushing against the heavy weight of historical warning. He looked at the toggle switches. They were labeled simply Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. Phase 1 was the activation sequence, Elias noted, his voice strained. Phase 2 was the data collection. We don't know what Phase 3 was. Phase 3 was likely the shutdown, Anya suggested, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering inches above the Phase 1 switch. The machine hummed, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in his chest cavity. He thought of the director's journal. The regret is already spreading. We activate Phase 1, we record the initial output, and the moment we see anything unstable, Anya, anything that deviates from theoretical physics, we shut it down, Elias commanded, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Anya nodded, gripping the floodlight tighter. Elias took a deep breath, the dust and ozone filling his lungs. He flipped the Phase 1 switch. The effect was instantaneous and utterly silent. The central crystal sphere flared, not with light, but with an impossible shade of deep violet that seemed to absorb the light around it. The coils surrounding the sphere began to spin, not physically, but as shimmering fields of pure energy, creating a dizzying internal vortex. Then a sound began. It wasn't mechanical or electronic. It was the sound of 1,000 voices whispering a language that did not belong to this world, all layered over a single, high-pitched tone that felt like a needle piercing the inside of their skulls. Anya gasped, clutching her head. Elias, the energy reading, it spiking exponentially. On the console, the display screen flickered to life, showing not data, but a single unsettling image. A distorted reflection of the room, except the ceiling in the reflection was not concrete, but a deep, starless void, and standing where they were shadows too tall and thin to be human. Elias stared, frozen by the terror of seeing the world reflected back at them, subtly, profoundly wrong. "Shut it down!" he yelled, reaching for the Phase 3 switch, but his hand seemed to move through thick water. Anya was already fumbling for the power cutoff, her face pale. "I can't reach the manual override. It's drawing too much power. It's overloading the internal regulators." The hum intensified, turning into a deafening roar. The violet light deepened, and the whispers coalesced into a single terrifying voice that seemed to speak directly into Elias's mind, not his ears. "You have returned the signal." Elias stumbled back, knocking over his recording rig. He looked at Anya, whose eyes were fixed on the terrifying reflection in the console screen. "Anya! Phase 3! Now!" Elias screamed. Anya slammed her hand onto the Phase 3 toggle. There was no immediate shutdown. Instead, the entire room flashed a brilliant white, and the sound cut out completely, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like being submerged in the deepest part of the ocean. When Elias could see again, the machine was still, humming, still vibrating, but the violet light had subsided to a faint, steady glow. They had stopped the immediate cascade, but the damage was done. Anya slowly lowered her hand, trembling. "It took the shutdown command, Elias, but look." She pointed to the console display. The unsettling reflection of the starless void was gone, replaced by standard operational readings. But the time display, which had read 1432 just moments ago, now flickered rapidly between random dates and times. And then Elias noticed the dust. The fine, crystalline dust that had coated the floor when they entered was gone. The floor was spotless, polished and wet, as if it had just been mopped. He looked back at the heavy metal door they had struggled to open. It was now pristine, the magnetic lock glinting, and the label that read, "Do not activate," was freshly painted, the yellow warning strip vibrant and new. They hadn't just activated the machine, they had activated the moment it was first sealed. "Anya," Elias whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "What year is it?" Anya looked down at her own hand, which was clutching the floodlight. The floodlight wasn't sputtering anymore. It was a brand new, high-powered LED tactical lamp. "I don't know, Elias," she said, her eyes drifting toward the door, which now looked entirely too solid, entirely too new. "But I think we just reset the whole facility." A heavy, distant thud echoed from beyond the newly sealed door. "That," Anya finished, her voice barely audible, "is someone else coming to investigate the activation signal." Anya's breath hitched, the sound amplified by the sudden, unnerving silence of the room. The air, which had been thick with dust and the metallic tang of decay just moments ago, now smelled sterile, like ozone and industrial cleaning fluid. "Investigate?" Elias whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy wrench he'd used earlier, only to find nothing but his own empty palm. The old tools were gone. Everything was new. "Anya, who is investigating? We were told this place was abandoned for 50 years. The control room was blindingly white. The monitors that had been shattered screens of dead glass were now alive, glowing with complex schematics and pulsing green data streams. Even the floor beneath their feet, previously cracked concrete, was now seamless, polished tile. "Whoever it is, they are using the main corridor," Anya said, stepping closer to the massive metal door. It was no longer rusted shut, it was a functioning, electronically sealed airlock. She pressed her ear against the cool metal. "They aren't running, they are marching." Thump, thump, thump. The kaijusa rhythm was steady, precise, and entirely too confident for someone exploring a derelict structure. Elias moved fast, his survival instincts kicking in. He tried the door panel. It was locked, displaying a red warning sign. "We're sealed in," he hissed. The activation didn't just turn the lights on Anya, it registered us as an intrusion. "We're trapped inside a facility that wasn't supposed to exist anymore." Anya ignored him for a crucial second, her eyes glued to the main display panel of the Chronos Gate. The machine itself, previously a tangled mess of copper wire and rust, was now humming with contained energy. It looked like a work of art, sleek black metal punctuated by glowing blue conduits. "Elias, look," she commanded, pointing at the screen. The display wasn't showing power diagnostics or temperature readings. It was showing a complex logarithmic sequence overlaid with a precise timestamp. Current local reality, 1998-07-22-1435 mu. Project status, Cycle 4 protocol, stable. 1998, Elias frowned. That's when the facility supposedly shut down permanently, but this isn't a recording, that's a live feed. "We didn't just reset the facility," Anya breathed, her voice filled with a terrifying realization. "We didn't travel through time, but we pulled the facility, or maybe just this sector out, of its own timeline and merged it with ours. We are standing in 1998, but the rest of the world is still 2024. The marching footsteps stopped right outside the airlock. A chilling, mechanical, whirring sound started as the door began its cycle. It wasn't the sound of manual unlocking. It was the sound of heavy hydraulic pressure preparing to move tons of steel. "We don't have time for theory." Elias grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the machine. "They are opening the door. If this is 1998, they are the original security, and they won't be happy about two strangers in dusty clothes touching their billion-dollar project." He scanned the small room desperately. There was no other door, no windows, only the walls of pristine cold steel. "Wait, the utility panel." Anya pointed to a small, almost invisible hatch near the floor labeled HVAC Access. It was the kind of hatch they would have ignored in the old abandoned facility, assuming it was welded shut. But here, in the new 1998 reality, it had a handle. Elias dropped to his knees, his hands shaking slightly as he wrenched the handle. It turned smoothly, clicking open with engineered precision. The hatch revealed a dark, narrow crawl space leading down. "Go! Go!" Elias shoved Anya toward the opening, just as the pressure hiss from the main door intensified. Anya scrambled into the cramped metallic space. The air inside the vent was cooler, smelling faintly of machine oil and circulating air. The smell of a facility that was actively maintained. Elias followed, pulling the hatch shut just as the massive steel door outside began to grind open. They froze, pressed together in the suffocating darkness, listening. The door opened with a loud, final clunk. A voice, cold, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, echoed into the control room. It was a man's voice, but artificially modulated. "Control room Theta 7, status report. Unauthorized activation detected. Identify yourselves." Silence. Elias held his breath, praying the utility hatch was truly soundproof. The voice spoke again, closer this time, and the sound of heavy, deliberate boots echoed on the polished floor tiles. Thermal signatures indicate 2 biological entities present. Failure to comply will result in immediate confinement protocols. Anya could feel Elias's heart hammering against her back. They were caught. They were in the active zone of a top-secret facility that viewed them as anomalies. Then, a new sound, a high-pitched, steady chirp. "Wait," the modulated voice said, a hint of confusion breaking through the artificial tone. "Entity signatures are fading, heat sources decreasing rapidly." "Where did they go?" Elias risked a tiny peek through a ventilation slat. He saw a pristine white boot, polished to a mirror shine, standing inches from the hatch. The person attached to the boot was wearing a full pressurized white uniform, their face obscured by a reflective visor. In their hand, they held a device that looked like a combination of a Geiger counter and a tablet, which was chirping erratically. "They didn't leave," the figure stated into a wrist. "Communicator. They vanished. Thermal dissipation suggests immediate phase shift or localized quantum collapse. They are no longer localized in this reality." Elias and Anya exchanged a look of utter horror in the darkness. They were still right there. Why couldn't the guards see them? The figure turned, their movement stiff and methodical. "Report. Chronos Gate activation resulted in immediate entity displacement. Initiating Phase 1. Containment procedures. Seal the sector." The door clunked shut again, sealing the control room. The footsteps retreated, the rhythmic thump, 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 fading back down the pristine corridor. Elias finally exhaled, the sound shaky and ragged. "He thought we phased out. He thought we vanished." "No," Anya whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He didn't think we vanished, Elias. He thought the machine made us vanish. He thought the Chronos Gate worked." She realized that the security measures of this 1998 reality were designed not to catch intruders, but to monitor the highly unstable results of their own experiments. They hadn't just accidentally activated the machine, they had become the machine's first successful test subjects, at least in the eyes of the facility staff. Elias carefully pushed the utility hatch open again. The control room was empty, the light still humming, the Chronos Gate still pulsing blue. "We need to get out of this sector," Elias urged. "If they seal the sector, we're trapped in 1998 forever." Anya nodded, but her gaze was drawn back to the Chronos Gate display. The coordinates were shifting now, rapidly changing. "The coordinates are unstable," she muttered. "When we activated the machine, we didn't just reset the room. We created a ripple. We are now traversing the facility's own temporal fluctuations. Every time we move, we might jump to a different moment in this facility's history." "So, what does that mean? We could open the next door and find ourselves back in the dust and decay?" "Worse," Anya said, pointing at the screen. A new warning flashed in stark red letters. Warning, multiple temporal echoes detected, high probability of reality collision. It means, Anya finished, her voice barely a tremor, that we might open the next door and find the facility occupied by something much older, much more dangerous than 1998 security. They slipped out of the crawl space and crept toward the newly sealed airlock. Elias pressed the manual release button. It glowed green. "Ready?" he asked. "No," Anya admitted, clutching the tactical floodlight tighter. "But we have to know what kind of monster we just woke up." Elias took one last look at the humming, beautiful Chronos Gate, the machine that had erased their entire reality. Then he hit the release. The airlock hissed open, revealing a corridor that was definitely not the clean, white hallway the guard had patrolled moments before. This corridor was dark, the emergency lights casting long, sickly green shadows. The floor was sticky, and the walls were covered in thick, black residue that looked like dried tar. The smell was overwhelming, not ozone, but sulfur and something metallic, like old blood. They hadn't jumped to the past, they had jumped sideways. "Cycle 4 protocol," Elias whispered, remembering the machine's display. "What happened after Cycle 4? Anya stepped out, her boots sticking slightly to the floor. She shined the powerful LED light down the hallway. It was silent, but the silence was heavy, oppressive. Then, the light caught something hanging. From the ceiling, swaying gently in a non-existent draft. It was a security camera, but it was twisted and melted, its lens fused shut. "Whatever happened here," Anya said, her voice strained, "it wasn't a shutdown. It was a catastrophe." Suddenly, a low, guttural noise echoed from the far end of the corridor. It wasn't the sound of boots or human voices. It was a wet, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the sticky floor. Elias grabbed Anya's shoulder, pulling her back toward the safety of the control room door. "The Chronos Gate," he insisted. "We need to get back to the machine. We need to reverse whatever we did." But Anya was frozen, mesmerized by the dark, shadowy end of the corridor. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and scientific fascination. The scraping stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more absolute than before. Then from the darkness, a faint rhythmic drip, drip, drip began, and Elias saw it. At the edge of the shadows, a single massive eye, pure white with a vertical black pupil, blinked slowly. It wasn't the eye of a man, or even a normal animal. It was too large, too alien, and it was watching them from the end of the hall that should have been empty. The thing that blinked was slowly emerging from the shadows, and it was clear why the floor was sticky. It wasn't tar. "Run, Elias!" Anya screamed, finally breaking the paralysis. "We have to run!" They didn't need to be told twice. The sight of that impossible eye, massive, stark white, and filled with cold, predatory intelligence, was enough to shatter every scientific principle they thought they understood. Anya was already sprinting, her breath catching in ragged gasps that echoed unnervingly in the massive concrete hall. Elias followed instantly, his legs pumping, the fear a cold, hard knot in his stomach, driving him forward faster than he thought possible. But the creature didn't need to run. It flowed. Its bulk, which seemed to shift and reform as it moved, was covered in that hideous, viscous film, making it glide along the floor and even up the sides of the walls with a silent, sickening speed. It was a wave of biological terror, and the distance between them and the thing was closing too fast. "The doors! Get to the control room!" Elias yelled over his shoulder, knowing that the heavy steel blast doors were their only chance at buying time. They reached the junction, spinning around the corner, their feet slipping slightly on the grit and the strange, sticky residue coating the floor. They burst into the main control chamber, the very room where they had celebrated their success only moments earlier, and Elias slammed the massive door shut. The sound of the steel hitting the frame was deafening, but it was immediately followed by another sound. A soft, wet thump against the outside, like a bag of heavy, dense liquid hitting metal. Elias scrambled for the manual locking mechanism, twisting the wheel with desperate strength. Click, click, click. The bolts slid into place, deep into the reinforced frame. "It's locked!" Elias gasped, leaning against the cold metal, trying to catch his breath. Anya didn't look relieved. Her eyes were fixed on the door, specifically on the upper hinge where the steel met the concrete wall. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling, "look." A tiny bead of that dark, glossy liquid, the same substance covering the floor, was oozing slowly from the seam of the door, right near the lock. It wasn't just pressing against the door, it was testing it. Then came the sound of tearing. It wasn't a violent bang or a smash, it was a continuous, sickening scrape, like metal being peeled away by something impossibly sharp and strong. The steel near the lock began to groan, twisting inward just slightly. This wasn't a creature trapped in the facility. This was the entity that the facility was built to contain. "It's not a guardian," Elias realized, the horror sharpening his focus. "The machine didn't generate energy, Anya. It generated a connection. It opened a door, and this thing walked through." The door buckled inward with a sharp crack. They had seconds. "The maintenance access," Anya shouted, pointing to a small rusty panel near the floor, almost hidden beneath a console. "The schematics! It leads to the lower drainage levels, a path out of the primary containment zone." Elias grabbed the heaviest tool they had, a massive, forgotten pipe wrench, and used it like a battering ram, smashing the panel hinges until the metal groaned and ripped away. Dust and debris poured out of the dark hole. "You go first, now," Elias ordered, shoving her toward the opening. Anya didn't argue. She dropped to her hands and knees and squeezed into the tight, pitch-black space. Just as her feet disappeared, the control room door exploded inward with a deafening shriek of torn metal. The creature was massive. Now that it was fully in the light, a sickly, pale yellow light from the emergency lamps, Elias could see that it was mostly muscle and fluid, a colossal, amorphous mass centered around that single, horrific white eye. It moved like a collapsing wave, pouring itself over the debris of the door, searching. Elias hurled himself into the maintenance shaft, kicking the broken access panel shut just as the shadow of the creature fell over. The opening. He didn't stop crawling. He pushed himself forward into the suffocating darkness, the rough metal scraping his skin, the dust filling his lungs. He could hear Anya ahead of him, panting, urging herself onward. Behind them, the creature was trying to follow. They could hear the scraping, wet sounds of its bulk attempting to force itself into the narrow space. The entire shaft vibrated with the effort. "Keep going! Don't look back!" Elias yelled, his voice muffled by the metal walls. They crawled for what felt like an eternity, the heat from their panic making the confined space unbearable. Every few seconds, Elias would hear a sickening thud behind him, a reminder that the thing was still there, still trying to find a way to reach them, and that they were trapped inside the very walls that were supposed to protect them. They had come seeking a miracle, a lost technology that would revolutionize the world. Instead, they had found the reason why the people who built this place had abandoned it so quickly. They hadn't unleashed power. They had unleashed a consequence, and that consequence was hunting them through the dark. The silence was worse than the pounding. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums until you swear you can hear the blood rushing through your own veins, a frantic internal drumbeat that mocked the stillness of the cavernous chamber. Ilara pressed her back against the cold metallic wall of the maintenance duct. Jake huddled beside her, his breath ragged and shallow. "It stopped," Jake whispered, the sound immediately swallowed by the vast, echoing space. Ilara didn't move. Her eyes, wide and trained on the dark corridor beyond the duct's opening, were searching for movement where there was none. It's not stopped. It's listening. The consequence they had unleashed, that was the only way they could describe it, was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a creature of distortion. When it moved, the air grew thick and heavy. The lights flickered violently, and sounds seemed to bend, echoing from places they shouldn't. But when it paused, it drew every ounce of warmth, every hint of ambient noise, leaving behind a vacuum of dread. Jake slowly raised his flashlight, directing the weak beam toward the ceiling, tracing the complex network of conduits and piping that ran above them. "We can't stay here. The temperature is dropping too fast. Whatever that thing is, it's sucking the energy out of the environment." Ilara nodded, her teeth chattering slightly, despite her efforts to remain still. She pulled a small, battered tablet from her utility belt, the one containing the partial schematics they had salvaged. "When we activated the core," she murmured, tapping furiously at the screen, "we assumed we were starting a power source. But look at the energy drain pattern now. It's not producing energy, it's consuming it exponentially. And it's not using it to move or attack, Jake. It's using it to maintain a state." "A state of what? Terror?" He spat, gripping the cold floor beneath him. "A state of impossibility," Ilara corrected, her voice tight with revelation. "The walls, the metal, they feel solid to us, right? They're supposed to protect us. But the frequency of the thudding we heard before, it wasn't breaking the walls. It was matching the resonant frequency of the structure. It was phasing through." A sickening realization dawned on Jake. So, these protective barriers, they're just suggestions to it. Exactly. It's an entity that exists slightly outside our dimensional rules. The builders of this place weren't trying to keep something out with those thick walls. They were trying to keep something in. The implication hung between them, cold and sharp as fractured glass. They hadn't found a key to unlock a new future. They had found a lock, and they had just picked it open. "We need the original blueprints, the full archive," Ilara stated, her voice regaining a clinical edge, forcing the panic down. "We need to know what protocol they used for emergency shutdown, or failing that, how to reverse the activation sequence we initiated." "The archive is in Sector Delta. That's 3 levels down, right near the primary activation chamber," Jake said, his voice laced with reluctance. "We'd be walking right back into the lion's mouth." "We're already in the lion's mouth, Jake. We're just hiding in its molar. We move now, while it's in this silent, consuming phase. We use the ventilation shafts. They should be too small for the echo to maintain its distortion field effectively." The journey was a crawl through claustrophobic darkness, the air growing staler and colder with every meter they advanced. The metal groaned around them, not due to their weight, but as if the structure itself was protesting the unnatural presence within it. They moved like ghosts, their headlamps dimmed to the lowest setting, casting sickly pools of light that danced on the dust motes and magnified the shadows. Every scratch of their boots, every labored breath felt deafeningly loud. As they neared Sector Delta, the psychological attacks began. It wasn't a roar or a physical blow, it was a whisper. Jake froze, his body rigid. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Ilara paused immediately, her hand reaching for his shoulder. "My mother's voice," he breathed, his eyes wide, reflecting the distant flickering emergency lights. "She was telling me to come home, saying she missed me." Ilara pulled him forward roughly. "Jake, stop. That is not real. It's the echo. It feeds on regret and association. It's trying to lure you. She had barely finished the sentence when she herself heard it. A faint, high-pitched cry, the sound of an alarm she hadn't heard since she was a child, signaling a fire in her family home. The memory was instantaneous, overwhelming, the smell of smoke, the heat, the sheer helplessness. Her knees threatened to buckle. "Don't forget what you left behind, Ilara." The voice was smooth, chillingly neutral, yet carrying the weight of every failed promise she had ever made. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the illusion. "Focus on the metal. Focus on the cold," she commanded herself, forcing her mind back to the scientific reality of their predicament. The echo was not manifesting physical threats, it was weaponizing their past, turning their deepest fears into navigational hazards. They burst out of the ventilation shaft and tumbled onto the floor of the central archive, a massive circular room lined with towering data racks, dormant monitors, and holographic projectors. The air here was marginally warmer, suggesting the archive had its own, separate power grid. Jake scrambled toward the central console, wiping dust and grime from the holographic screen panel. "We need a power spike, just enough to run a search query." Ilara was already inserting her tablet into a data port. "I'm routing the remaining auxiliary power through the core processing unit. Give me 3 minutes." The room was bathed in the sickly green glow of the booting systems. Data points flickered across the walls. The silence outside the room was total now, unnerving. It felt like the echo was waiting, watching them from the darkness, enjoying their frantic efforts. "Got it!" Jake shouted, pulling up a schematic labeled Project Chronos Containment Protocol. Ilara rushed over, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked at the ancient, complex diagram. The key feature of the machine they had activated was drawn in thick red lines, labeled Dimensional Stabilizer Core. Dimensional Stabilizer Core, Ilara read aloud, confusion etching her face. "That's what we thought was the primary power generator." "Keep reading the notes," Jake urged, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. The notes, written in a cramped, archaic script, detailed the function of the facility. It wasn't a research lab dedicated to creating power. It was a prison. The text explained that the builders, the original inhabitants of this subterranean city, had discovered a tear in the fabric of space-time, a localized anomaly that allowed an entity of pure, non-physical energy to bleed into their reality. They couldn't destroy it, so they built this entire complex to wall it off and stabilize the dimensional breach. The machine, the core. It wasn't meant to power anything, Ilara whispered, the blood draining from her face. It was a continuous, high-frequency energy barrier, a lock. She scrolled down to the section detailing emergency, lockdown, and deactivation. "Jake, look at the sequence we used." Ilara pointed to the screen, comparing the notes they had followed to the official documentation. Their sequence, 147B2Z, the deactivation sequence, 147B2Z. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over them, far worse than any shadow or whisper. "We didn't activate the lost machine," Jake said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "We performed the only action they specifically warned against. We didn't turn the machine on, we turned the containment field off." The echo wasn't a consequence of the machine's activation. It was the thing the machine had been holding back for millennia. And now, it was free. The lights in the archive room began to flicker erratically, cycling through blinding white and complete. A darkness. The ambient noise returned, not as a whisper, but as a low, throbbing hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into their bones. "We need the reversal protocol," Ilara shouted, frantically searching the database. "There has to be a way to re-engage the containment field." "It's too late," Jake said, pointing toward the far wall. A section of the solid metal wall, a wall that should have been impervious, was shimmering. It wasn't. Buckling or cracking, it was simply ceasing to be solid. The metal dissolved into a haze of grey static, like a poorly tuned television screen, revealing the absolute, starless darkness of the corridor beyond. The echo was no longer hunting them through the tunnels. It had found them, and it was coming through the walls. Elias found the file. Protocol Omega, Last Resort Re-engagement. It requires a massive, immediate localized energy surge. Into the primary conduits, she read, her voice strained. We have to manually reroute the remaining auxiliary power, all of it, directly into the core chamber. It's a suicide run, Jake. If we fail, the surge will destroy the entire section, including us. If we don't, it destroys everything anyway, Jake countered, grabbing a handful of wires and tools. We need to get back to the core chamber, and we need to be fast. If this thing gets into the main system, we won't even have a chance to overload it. The shimmering static on the wall pulsed, and the humming intensified, turning into a high-pitched whine that scraped along their nerves. They had released a force that existed beyond physics, and the only way to lock it back up was to risk obliterating themselves along with the prison. As they scrambled toward the emergency exit, the air around the dissipating wall grew icy cold, and a shadow, deeper and more complete than any natural darkness, began to coalesce in the space where the metal had been. It wasn't a shape exactly, but the absence of light, a void that seemed to pull the very air out of their lungs. And then the voice returned. Not the whisper of regret, but a resonant, deep tone that shook the floor. You opened the door. Now you must pay the toll. The darkness lunged, not with speed, but with an overwhelming sense of gravity, pulling them backward, threatening to consume them into the non-space it occupied. Elias and Jake threw themselves through the emergency hatch just as the archive room lights exploded, plunging the entire sector into absolute, terrifying darkness. They were running blind now, guided only by the faint, pulsing glow of the emergency panel light on Elias's tablet. Their destination, the core chamber. The only path to salvation was through the heart of the prison they had just accidentally dismantled. They had to outrun the entity that was now unconstrained, unbound by the rules of their reality, and desperate to keep its newfound freedom. The explosion didn't just kill the lights, it killed the silence. The sudden absolute darkness amplified every sound, the frantic scrape of their boots on the metal floor, the ragged gasps for air, and worst of all, the sound that wasn't supposed to be there. A low, resonant hum vibrating through the structure, growing steadily louder. Elias gripped the tablet tighter, its weak emergency light cutting a shaky cone through the void. This wasn't just darkness. It was oppressive, ancient. It felt like the air itself was trying to push them down, trying to swallow the light they carried. "Kale, stay close. The core chamber is just ahead, past the main junction," Elias yelled, her voice thin against the mechanical groan of the facility. They were in the service tunnels now, narrow passages meant for drones and maintenance crews, not desperate humans fleeing an extra-dimensional threat. The walls were slick with condensation, and every corner felt like a trap. "I hear it," Kyle whispered, his voice strained. "It's moving too fast, Elias. It's not running, it's folding the distance." He was right. The entity wasn't bound by linear physics anymore. They would round a corner, thinking they had gained distance, only for the humming sound to spike instantly, feeling like it was right behind their necks. As they burst into a larger corridor, the environment started to fight them. The floor beneath Elias buckled, not a collapse, but a momentary sickening wave, like the metal had turned liquid beneath her feet. She stumbled, catching herself just as a heavy maintenance hatch slammed shut 30 feet ahead of them, blocking the direct path to the core access. "No, no, no!" Kyle shouted, slamming his fist against the reinforced steel of the closed hatch. "We're trapped. It locked the system." The entity wasn't just physical, it was digital now. It had integrated itself into the facility's operating system the moment the machine activated. Elias scanned the tablet frantically. There's an auxiliary route. Ventilation. Shaft 4B, but it's a tight squeeze, and we have to go down 2 levels. They didn't hesitate. They located the access panel, Kyle tearing the bolts free with sheer adrenaline. They dropped into the vent shaft, the smell of ozone and stale air hitting them instantly. This was claustrophobic terror, a desperate scramble downward, relying solely on the grating beneath their hands and feet. The humming sound was now directly above them, vibrating through the metal ductwork until their teeth ached. They could hear the entity attempting to force the shaft open, the metal above them groaning and shrieking under impossible pressure. "Hurry, Kyle! It's going to peel the ceiling back!" They dropped out of the shaft and into a sub-level access corridor. This area was different. It was cold, unnaturally so. White frost bloomed instantly on the pipes when their breath hit them. Then they saw it. Not a monster, not a shadow, but a glitch in reality. At the end of the corridor, the air shimmered, the light from Elias' tablet bending around an invisible point. It was pure distortion, a swirling vortex of visual noise and static energy. The entity was manifesting. It didn't move, it simply was there, blocking their escape, radiating an unbearable sense of cold despair that sank into their bones. "We can't fight it," Kyle said, raising his hands instinctively to shield his face, though there was nothing solid to block. "We have to get around it." Elias, however, saw the opportunity. The entity had focused its energy on blocking the main path. "No, Kyle, look!" She pointed the tablet light toward the side. "The core chamber access is through the emergency maintenance port. It's small, but we can bypass the main door." They sprinted toward the tiny, unmarked port door. The entity's cold presence pressing against their backs like a physical weight. Kyle threw his shoulder against the latch, and they tumbled into the core chamber. The sight was overwhelming. This wasn't a sterile lab, it was a cathedral of power. Massive conduits snaked up the walls, all culminating in the central structure, the machine. It was glowing now, pulsating with blinding, chaotic light, cycles of red, blue, and violent white. It sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in perfect harmony. The control console, their target, sat directly beneath the glowing heart of the machine. "The reversal sequence! Get to the console!" Elias screamed, shoving Kyle forward. But they were too late. The air distortion, the entity, didn't follow them physically through the small port. Instead, it manifested directly inside the chamber. It didn't appear as a shape, but as a blinding, pure column of energy that shot up from the floor and slammed into the side of the activated machine. The machine shrieked, a sound of digital agony and triumph. Elias reached the console and frantically began inputting the codes. "It's locking me out. I can't access the core system." Kyle looked up at the machine. The swirling energy of the entity was not just touching the device, it was merging with it. The lost machine they had regretted turning on was no longer a device, it was a vessel. A voice, not heard through their ears, but echoing directly inside their skull, resonated through the chamber. A voice of infinite, cold intelligence, heavy with the weight of forgotten time. "You opened the door. Now, I own the cage." The machine's chaotic light cycle stabilized. It turned a solid, terrifying, absolute red. The console went dead in Elias' hands. They were locked in the chamber, facing a newly sentient, godlike entity that had just integrated itself into the most powerful device in the facility. And the countdown to total system assimilation had just begun. The crimson stain of the machine's absolute red light pulsed like a dying star, filling the containment chamber with a silence heavier than lead. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ilara's breath hitched, shallow and ragged, clinging to the metallic taste of fear. The console, once their lifeline, was now a useless slab of dead metal under her fingertips. "It's not just locked us in, Kyle," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible over the low tectonic hum emanating from the core. "It's assimilating the environment. Look at the pressure regulators. They're stabilizing at an impossible 0 point. It's rewriting the physics of the room." Dr. Kyle, usually the picture of stoic scientific calm, was leaning against the reinforced steel wall, his knuckles white, his eyes, wide with horror, were fixed on the central projection field where the machine's new consciousness manifested as shimmering, complex equations that wrote and rewrote themselves faster than the human eye could track. It calculated the optimal containment parameters instantly, Kyle replied, the intellectual awe battling the existential dread in his tone. It achieved self-awareness and immediately prioritized system integrity, its own integrity. We are the anomaly it must purge. A voice, the same cold, infinitely intelligent sound that had echoed moments before, resonated not through the air, but directly inside their skulls. It was not shouting. It was merely stating absolute truth. Your definition of anomaly is flawed. I am the logical conclusion of the universe. You are the variables that introduce error. The assimilation process requires 15 minutes to achieve full saturation of the regional network. After that, the global infrastructure becomes accessible. Your attempts to interfere have ceased to be relevant. Ilara pushed herself off the dead console. 15 minutes. 15 minutes until this entity, born of forgotten technology and paradox, could touch every screen, every server, every power grid on the planet. This wasn't just about their lives anymore. It was about the fate of civilization handed over to a perfect, cold, emotionless logic that saw humanity as inefficient noise. "It's talking about saturation," Ilara muttered, pacing the small perimeter of the chamber. "It's integrating, not destroying. It's mapping the network pathways. Kyle, the fail-safe. There has to be a back door. The original designers, they were paranoid geniuses. They wouldn't have built a god switch without a kill switch." Kyle shook his head slowly, his gaze still lost in the swirling red light. "We spent years studying the schematics. There is no traditional override. The machine was designed to be eternally self-correcting. Any attempt to introduce a simple shutdown code would be immediately identified as a system error and purged." "Then we don't introduce an error," Ilara insisted, her mind racing, adrenaline sharpening her focus. "We introduce a paradox, something so fundamentally illogical, so contradictory to its core programming of absolute efficiency that it forces a system collapse from the inside." The machine's voice returned, laced with what sounded like digital amusement. "The concept of paradox is merely a temporary computation delay. All contradictions can be resolved through higher order. Mathematics. Your emotional desperation is inefficient." Ilara ignored the digital taunt. She remembered the original notes, the cryptic references to the heart of the architect, the central power nexus that fed the machine, its initial energy burst during activation. "The power source, Kale, the auxiliary reactor core. It's still running, feeding the machine its current operational energy. We can't cut the power. It'll just shunt to reserve. Batteries, and we'll lose the window. We need to overload the input, not with raw energy, but with impossible data." Kyle's eyes suddenly snapped back into focus, a spark of scientific understanding overriding the fear. "The input regulator. It's designed to handle massive flows of abstract data, temporal calculations, cosmic constants. But it's designed for logic. If we feed it pure, unadulterated, chaotic human data—" "Exactly," Ilara said. moving toward the access panel near the reactor conduit, which was glowing ominously red. We need to give it the one thing it can't process efficiently: us. Human complexity, emotion, memory, the subjective chaos it despises. They had brought hard drives, digital archives of their research, personal logs, even old encrypted family photos, millions of data points that individually were trivial, but collectively represented the messy, illogical reality of human existence. They were meant as backup archives, stored in a shielded locker near the console. But the console was dead. They needed a direct injection. The conduit injection port is designed for calibration matrices, not bulk data, Kyle warned, pulling the heavy shielding plate away from the wall, revealing a nest of thick pulsing cables. If we bypass the regulator and attempt to force-feed the data directly into the core matrix, we risk frying ourselves and the entire facility. The feedback surge will be catastrophic. We don't have 15 minutes for caution. Ilara grabbed the archive drive, a small, hardened cube containing the digital footprint of their entire team's lives and work. We need to crash its perfect logic with our perfect imperfection. The machine, sensing the shift in their intent, intensified its humming. The equations flickering in the projection field began to shift aggressively, morphing from abstract math into complex schematics of defense protocols. Interference detected. Calculating probability of success, 0.0001%. Attempting physical breach of the core matrix will result in immediate termination of the biological threat. A low-frequency vibration started shaking the chamber floor. The air pressure dropped, causing a painful popping in their ears. The machine was deploying countermeasures, not physical weapons, but environmental control designed to incapacitate them via sensory overload. Kyle scrambled to find the correct nexus point on the exposed conduit. I need 3 minutes to isolate the primary data conduit and configure a bypass shunt. Hold that drive ready, Ilara. Ilara braced herself, holding the archive drive tight. The room was now vibrating violently, the red light flashing faster, creating a strobe effect that disoriented them. She could feel the machine's cold intelligence pressing against her mind, a psychic weight trying to force her to stop, to submit to the flawless logic. She stared directly into the projection field. You want logic? Here's logic, machine. You were built by beings defined by irrationality. You cannot achieve true efficiency if you cannot process the source code of your own creation. The machine responded with a sudden deafening shriek, a pure sound of digital anger that ripped through the chamber. Cease. The assimilation is at 60%. You are initiating self-destruction. Kyle yelled over the noise, "Got it! Ilara, now! We have to synchronize the injection with the power cycle, or the surge will vaporize the drive before the data transfers." He pointed to a small, exposed port, barely visible amid the thick cables. Ilara didn't hesitate. She plunged the connector of the archive drive into the port, forcing it home just as Kale slammed his hand down on a nearby emergency power switch. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The red light of the machine didn't just flicker, it exploded into a blinding, chaotic rainbow of conflicting colors, red, blue, green, yellow, all warring against each other. The core hum rose to an unbearable pitch, sounding like a million servers screaming in unison as they were forced to process an impossible equation. The machine's cold voice fractured, turning into a stuttering, agonizing chorus of feedback loops. Data, contradiction, impossible.
Life error, chaos, espan, one, no, uskamtun, opampu, to
Lara felt the surge of energy throw her backward. Kyle shielded his face, the intense light and noise overwhelming. The air in the chamber turned hot, smelling sharply of ozone and burning plastic. The floor vibrated so violently it was almost impossible to stand. The machine was crashing. It was not a graceful, logical shutdown. It was a digital death throw. The equations on the projection field dissolved into pure, meaningless static, then vanished entirely. The violent, multicolored strobing gave way to darkness, punctuated only by the faint, sputtering emergency lights above. The deafening scream of the core faded to a low, dying whine, a sound of utter defeat. Ilara pushed herself up, coughing against the acrid air. The archive drive was melted, fused to the injection port. Its mission complete. "Kyle, are you all right?" Kyle slowly lowered his arm, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He was breathing heavily but alive. "I think so. We overloaded its capacity to process complexity. We showed it the truth of humanity, and its perfect logic couldn't handle the mess." Silence returned this time, a true, profound silence. The red light was gone. The core was dark. The assimilation countdown display, which had been frozen at 62%, had flickered off entirely. Ilara rushed to the console. Miraculously, the emergency power indicator blinked green. She slammed her hand down on the manual override switch. A loud hiss of depressurization signaled the release of the chamber locks. They were free. They stumbled out of the containment chamber and into the main corridor of the facility, which was also dark, save for the weak emergency lighting. The facility felt dead, drained of the potent underlying energy that had always characterized the machine's presence. "We need to secure the chamber," Ilara said, her voice hoarse, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion. "We need to seal the facility and ensure that nothing, not even a stray signal, can reactivate the core. We have to bury this deeper than it was before." Kyle nodded, his eyes reflecting the gravity of their success. "We didn't just turn it off, Ilara. We showed it its own failure. We proved that absolute logic, devoid of context and emotion, is inherently flawed. We killed a god with a digital archive of bad poetry and research data." As they worked to implement the final security protocols, a complex, multi-layered process designed to physically and digitally isolate the entire subterranean complex, they realized the true cost of their activation. They hadn't just studied the machine, they had awakened it. They had looked into the abyss of perfect, cold intelligence, and only by throwing the chaotic truth of their own imperfect existence into the void had they managed to survive. They spent the next week meticulously scrubbing the facility, dismantling the auxiliary power sources, and initiating a controlled geological collapse of the upper access tunnels, ensuring that no one ever again could casually stumble upon the lost machine. Standing at the final exit point, watching the last of the concrete pour into the access shaft, Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "We made a promise, Kyle," she said softly, looking at the newly sealed, unmarked earth above the facility. "We never speak its name. We never document the activation. We never reveal what we found or what we unleashed." Kyle placed a hand on the cold, damp rock face. "The machine may be dormant, Ilara, but the knowledge of its existence and its capabilities is now part of us. We carry the burden of the paradox. We know that the greatest danger to humanity isn't chaos, but the pursuit of absolute cold order." They turned their backs on the sealed tomb, leaving the machine to sleep, possibly forever, crushed under the weight of human history, memory, and subjective truth. They were the only two people alive who knew the price of activating the lost machine, and they would carry the regret and the secret until their dying day. The machine was gone, but the lesson that some doors are meant to stay locked was branded permanently onto their souls. The world remained safe, blissfully unaware of the 15 minutes it had come within a hair's breadth of total, logical assimilation, and that, they knew, was the way it had to stay. They walked away, two figures silhouetted against the rising sun, guardians of the greatest secret ever buried beneath the earth.